And then obviously the last is mass killings, right? Just what we typically think of genocide, right? We typically think of genocide in terms of the technique of physical destruction and specifically the act of mass killings. When we think of genocide, this is specifically what we think of. But there's so many, as you see, there's such a variety of ways in which, techniques in which governments can exercise the destruction of a group. Typically what happens is that all of these happen in unison, right, as one huge sort of amalgamation of techniques. And it is not the case, at least I don't think it's the case, that Lemkin is saying is that each of these in and of themselves suffice to constitute acts of genocide. I think they're all necessary, but none in and of themselves are necessarily sufficient. That's just me. Okay, number 7, religious. And obviously the religious destruction, it's the destruction of religious buildings and artifacts, and the persecution and or the extermination of religious leaders, right? So the destruction, the willful, intentful destruction of religious buildings, religious artifacts, and the extermination or the forced emigration of religious leaders is the seventh technique of genocide. And then lastly, number 8 is moral. Right. The moral technique of genocide. This is actually pretty interesting. I'll read what I have. The creation of what Lemkin classifies as moral debasement. So it's the creation. This is the important point, right? It doesn't exist before, but once the territory has been occupied by the oppressor specifically targets members within the population of oppressed people to morally debase themselves, right? The creation of moral debasement among targeted group members. It's the promotion of drugs, alcohol, prostitution as a means of moral debasement. We want to, you want to see a gun shop in every corner of the ghetto, right? You want to see a liquor store everywhere. You want to see prostitution everywhere. You want to give credits and incentives to consume drugs and alcohol, right? You want to give incentives to get young girls and young women to become prostitutes, right? You want to encourage violence, right? You don't want them to have guns, obviously, but you want to encourage sort of intra-group violence, right? Because if we're targeting this group, we want you guys to kill each other off. That's great, right? That's less work for us. So moral debasement, and I think moral debasement is key. Very little, and I'm a philosopher, so you know I'm most interested in this, right? But the 8th technique of genocide, moral debasement, has almost not been studied at all, and I am extremely interested in sort of analyzing and looking at concepts of moral debasement in genocidal campaigns, right? How is moral debasement used as a tactic, as a tool in an active genocidal campaign, right? So these are the 8 techniques for genocide which Lemkin discussed. It was my intent in this lecture to continue our discussion into the nature of genocide, into the foundational concepts, the foundational ideas of genocide. We understood the distinction between genocide and depersonalization, genocide and denationalization. We understand the distinction between, or we understood Lemkin's account of the 2 phases of genocide. We talked about the distinction between genocide as an act of war from the sort of canonical traditional conception that Rousseau, the Rousseau-Portalis doctrine, claimed as war as an act or an aggression against the nation. We saw that that's completely different. Genocide is an aggression of war, an act of war against individual biological human beings. And then we ended by discussing the 8 forms of, or the 8 techniques rather, of genocide as described by Lemkin, and I've given you very brief examples of each of the 8 techniques. With that being said, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. Hopefully you'll tune in for my next series of videos. Thanks, and have a good day.